All right then, econ friends, welcome back. We're continuing our discussion of economic growth. In our last video, we gave some background, gave a definition, showed some historical ideas, and gave a bit of the math and the modeling behind it. Okay, you know that it's very important, and you have at least a brief idea based on what we kind of planted seeds on last time as to what can cause it. In this video, we're going to jump into more detail about how economic growth can occur. Now, I want to be really clear. There's a lot of debate in economics about this. Most economists agree on the primary ingredients for growth. You know, imagine that you're baking a cake. Okay, most economists agree about what needs to go into the cake. They disagree on how much of each ingredient to put in and on the role that each ingredient plays in this flavorful creation that you're going to make. Okay, so in economics, this is a hotly debated topic because it's considered very important. So what we're going to say is that economists agree in general on the ingredients of economic growth. They disagree on which ones are more important and the ingredient quantities and how much of each one. So we're going to skip that part and just focus on the ingredients, the components that most economists assume contribute to economic growth. And to understand this, let's start off with this big idea. In real practice, in the real world, the primary determinant, sorry, let's get back to blue. The primary determinant of economic growth comes down to one big thing: worker productivity. At its core, countries with more productive workers are richer countries. Countries with higher levels of worker productivity have higher real GDPs, have higher growth rates, and sustain those growth rates typically over time. So the big takeaway from this video, if you want to look at economic growth, the primary determinant is going to be worker productivity. Now, this, of course, leads to the question of, okay, so what determines that? And economists have identified several factors, right? Several ingredients into this cake of economic growth, as it were. Okay, let's go through these. Now, I'm going to give you a handful of these. The big thing I want you to bear in mind is that for each of these, there's some more in-depth and subtle diagnosis and discussion, and there's exceptions, and there's exceptions to exceptions. So it get kind of nuanced and kind of jargony. Do your best to stick with it, go into it, make sure you do your reading, and you'll get this, okay? So what are the factors? Well, the first factor we would say is physical capital per worker. If you remember the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, we know that physical capital, also called just capital, also called the capital stock, that this refers to all of the tools, all the equipment, all the structures that are used to produce goods and services. So everything from shovels and trucks to advanced factories to Tesla's new battery manufacturing facility to all the robots that help run the line production for the Toyota Camry. All of those things, big and small, simple and advanced, are physical capital, okay? I wanted to bring back, this is the, we had this one before. I wanted to bring this back and now illustrate to you what it means in terms of the different shifts. Notice that both of these have PPFs with consumption goods on top here and capital goods here. We know that in a world of scarcity, we have opportunity cost. One way to envision opportunity cost is in terms of the opportunity cost of capital good purchases versus consumption good purchases. If you think about it, any economy that has finite resources has to make a pretty big decision. Do we want to use our resources for more consumption, those everyday things that bring us utility that we tend to go through and consume quickly? Or do we want to use our income and wealth and resources for more capital accumulation? And notice that there's an opportunity cost. For a country to have more capital goods, they have to make the sacrifice, the opportunity cost in terms of consumer goods, okay? If you take a look at this, we'll kind of flesh it out. Let's look at panel A right here. In panel A, you see here country A, this blue dot. Notice that country A has decided to really invest in capital goods. So they're operating right here, very high on capital goods, but they've made the decision that they're going to be very low on consumption goods. You can say that this country, country A, they are sacrificing consumption today in order to have more consumption in the future. They're thinking long term. On the other hand, let's do this in red. You take a look at panel B, country B, and they're operating here. They are really having minimal capital good investment, instead choosing to value today's consumption. Country B is engaging in consumption today and therefore making sacrifices against future growth, okay? If we put this together, you can see it pretty clearly. Because country A, here in panel A, has chosen to engage in more capital good accumulation, more investment, they're going to grow very rapidly. Well, I shouldn't say rapidly. They won't grow rapidly, but they're going to grow bigger over time. On the other hand, country B, even though they're enjoying life today with their high amount of consumption, they're going to pay the price in the future, because while they're going to grow, their growth is going to be very small. So we can use the PPF to illustrate this first big idea that the main, well, not the main, but one of the main factors in economic growth is physical capital per worker. How much tools does a worker have? How much average capital does a typical worker have? Here's the general rule. We believe in economic growth theory that in general, as the quantity, the amount of physical capital per worker rises, so does output per worker. So we believe that, simply put, as workers have access to more capital, they're going to produce more output. Pretty straightforward. There are, however, several important caveats, okay? Several important exceptions to this. One exception is that there are diminishing returns to capital. Okay, big one here. One exception to this idea that more capital leads to more growth, okay, one caveat is that capital is subject to diminishing returns. Now, the idea of diminishing returns is so powerful in economics that it's really has the status of a law. It's an economic law. Call it the law of diminishing returns. What this says, and we'll go through this in a lot more detail with some math behind it in our micro section in a few weeks, okay? But what this says is that in any production process where you have one input constant, you can increase the amount of other inputs. But over time, and here's the key, over time, as you add more and more and more and more and more of an input to a production process, over time, those additional additions of input, those extra units of, in this case, capital added, will lead to smaller and smaller, less and less, AKA diminishing increases in output. Okay, there's a lot of jargon there, a lot of definition. So basically what it means in our theory here, in economic growth theory, what we believe is that as the amount of physical capital per worker increases, the additional, AKA marginal output. So the additional output is also called return. So again, we believe that as the amount of physical capital per worker increases, as you invest in more and more and more capital goods, the additional output from adding that capital will get smaller and smaller and smaller over time. In other words, it diminishes. I mean, you can imagine something as simple as you have a pizza shop. You have 5 workers who work there. You buy one oven, the productivity goes up. You buy another oven, the productivity might go up a bit. But as you keep adding ovens and keep adding ovens, each additional oven, each marginal oven will not raise production by all that much more. You can only do so many pizzas given a few workers and the constraints of the dough and the cheese and the sauce, okay? You can't just make infinite pizzas by buying infinite ovens. So the addition of additional, okay, marginal ovens, marginal additional capital will lead to less and less and less pizzas, diminishing returns. This is a powerful rule, a lot of jargon. So think of some examples. Even ask yourself, imagine you, as you study more and more and more, as you go through the first econ video, you're with me. By the 5th one, you're sick of me. So as you give more and more and more time to econ, your interest might sort of flatten out over time. That's natural with anything, okay? Because we are bound in many domains to the law of diminishing returns. To summarize it in economic jargon, what we say is this: the marginal return on capital declines over time, okay? The marginal return, in other words, the extra or additional output on capital declines over time. You keep adding more and more and more and more ovens to your pizza factory. The first couple of ovens will really spike your pizza productivity, have a lot of pies coming out of there. But as you add more and more and more and more ovens to a fixed pizza shop space with the fixed number of workers who have a fixed level of skill, you're eventually going to flatten out. Okay? That's a lot to think about. So we can summarize it with a nice picture. This right here is known as a production function. Now, we're going to go into this in more detail in a few minutes, but basically, a production function simply gives you a sense of the relationship between input and output, okay? In this production function, up here, we're measuring real GDP per worker, and down here, we're measuring it against physical capital per worker. And you can see, and I'll do it in red like he did, you can see that you have this shape. Notice that at the very beginning, in this segment right here, the production function is very steep. But as we go farther along and farther along, the slope gets flatter and flatter. Well, if you think about what that means, it's simply this. Early on, as you add initial amounts of physical capital, even a little bit of extra capital will lead to a really big increase in output in real GDP. Yet notice that as you go farther and farther and farther along, this additional level of capital only gives you a little bit. You're getting diminishing returns, okay? We'll go into some more detail on that later on, but I just wanted to share that with you because this is one of the caveats to the idea of the importance of capital. So to go back to our big picture, we're talking about the factors that influence productivity, that influence economic growth. We know that physical capital is one of them, but that is subject to a really strong constraint, and that constraint is diminishing returns, okay? Diminishing returns suggest that at some point then, there will be no more incentive to build or invest in any more capital. Imagine that your economy is operating right up here. What you're seeing is, hey, all this additional capital that we're investing in, all this additional spending isn't really generating all that much more real GDP per capita. So there's less incentive to build or invest in any more capital. And as a result, we believe in economic growth theory that eventually capital per worker will eventually stop growing. Okay, so that's one big caveat. Physical capital per worker, really important, but it's not going to solve all your problems because eventually the capital stock will stop growing. Okay, another caveat, let's see how I lettered this one here. Yeah, another caveat, another exception to this rule is that over time, capital depreciates. Depreciation refers to like the breakdown or the wearing out or the deterioration of goods. Okay, factories become obsolete, robots tend to break down, trucks stop running, roads kind of crumble. Okay, the reality is that over time capital will depreciate. As a result of this, we believe that the physical capital stock will only grow if over time new investment outpaces depreciation. So we believe that capital is important, but we know that capital has diminishing returns. We also know here that capital will depreciate. And as a result, you have to keep investing in more and more new capital, right? New equipment and new structures in order to outpace, to stay ahead of your depreciation, okay? In other words, what we call net investment, which is equal to investment minus depreciation, net investment must be positive if the capital stock is to grow. But again, as we said a minute ago, over time, as the PPF flattens out, no new investment will occur. So we believe that over time, net investment will stop growing, okay? There's one more caveat. So we talked about the idea of the capital stock and diminishing returns. We know there's depreciation. There's one more caveat that's really applicable to poor countries, which are called also developing countries. And this is that large capital investments will really only generate value if they mesh well with the rest of the economy. We see lots of poor countries attempt to invest in factories, for example, but they don't have the educated workforce to work in those factories. Or we'll see some countries invest in heavy manufacturing facilities and even robotics, but they don't have the underlying resource base of raw materials to make the products. So the factories sit empty. Or we'll see in some cases, poor countries will invest in advanced capital, advanced machineries, but they don't have any kind of infrastructure. So even when they produce items, it's very costly to get those items from the factory to markets because they have a terrible road system with really bad infrastructure, okay? So it's not enough to just throw capital at a problem. It has to mesh well strategically with the overall economy's well-being, okay? All of these caveats, they lead us to one very important insight, and that is that while capital accumulation is critically very important, capital accumulation cannot, will not, by itself sustain long-run economic growth. Capital accumulation can spark some economic growth. It can help an economy grow and kind of take off. But critical takeaway here, capital accumulation by itself cannot, will not sustain the long-term growth that we talked about earlier, okay? So that's one really big one. The second, going back to our ingredients, the second big ingredient, what we call human capital per worker. Human capital is pretty straightforward. It simply refers to the knowledge and to the skills that allow workers to be more productive. Those knowledges and skills often acquired through education, through job training, and sometimes just through experience and time, okay? You guys are in college studying these thrilling topics with this awesome professor, in part because without even knowing it, You're investing in your human capital. You're getting education, you're learning to think, you're learning theories that will help you be more productive workers. And hopefully, when you get your first jobs, your bosses will invest in you and they'll offer you training opportunities and they'll give you really challenging experience, all of which advances your human capital. A third ingredient in economic growth is technological progress, the idea of innovation, okay? We define technological advancements as any introduction of new techniques, of new methods that allow firms and workers to increase and sustain productivity. You know, this kind of stuff can be very simple, it can be very complex. You know, people oftentimes cite Henry Ford, you know, and the assembly line as an innovation that streamlined and made much more efficient car production. And that, in fact, was a great innovation. But innovations can also be very simple. For example, the very humble shipping container, which is that big thing that's on the back of a big rig that's usually blocking your path on the 10 freeway, right? Making you have to go slow because that jabroni's in front of you. Shipping containers, simple, but a powerful innovation because shipping containers, they standardized shipping worldwide, which meant that more goods could be moved more efficiently across the planet. Simple, misleadingly simple, vastly powerful, okay? We know that in advanced countries, especially, we had mentioned a minute ago that over time, capital accumulation will stall out and that capital by itself cannot sustain long-term growth. However, innovation can help offset the diminishing returns on capital. In fact, we believe in economics that, at least in theory, if there were to be no limits to technological progress, to innovation, there would be really theoretically no limits to economic growth. Okay. Through this lens, what we really focus on in modern growth theory, on many things, but one of the key things in modern growth theory is the idea that society's ability to produce new ideas is a critical key to sustain growth. The ability to produce, think through, evolve, iterate new ideas is crucial to sustain growth. Because notice that, unlike physical capital, ideas can be freely shared. Ideas do not depreciate. And critically, the presence of one set of new ideas usually promotes other new ideas. So ideas build on itself. They build on themselves. Knowledge builds on itself. Innovation builds on itself. And that's powerful. In fact, we believe that today, in most of the advanced world, the US and Canada, Japan, Western Europe, a few other countries in Southeast Asia, we believe that the real key driver of growth in advanced countries is tech progress. Our competitive advantage, in other words, in the rich world is our ability to innovate, okay? On the other hand, this implies that for poor countries, for developing countries, since the rich world is already forced to innovate to maintain its sustainability, to maintain its growth, poor countries oftentimes don't need to invent their own. They can simply adapt, take, borrow, sometimes steal existing technologies that are already in use. We call this the catch-up effect. And basically what it says is that poor countries, they don't need to spend all the money to reinvent the wheel. They can basically, over time, catch up with rich countries by taking, sometimes illegally, sometimes not, but by taking and adapting the innovations and technologies that the rich countries are already developing, okay? But again, there's always going to be some exceptions to exceptions. Please note that much like physical capital, technology can only generate growth and value when it's combined with the other inputs. A poor country that has a poorly educated workforce, an unhealthy population, poor infrastructure, they can't just adapt technology and expect to grow. Technology kind of is a lever. It provides leverage to existing inputs. And therefore, it's only going to generate growth and value and wealth if you have those other inputs. This is a big reason why, even though a lot of people say that the key difference between rich and poor countries is technology, that's really incorrect. It is incorrect to consider or identify technology and innovation as the only difference between the rich and the poor world, because technology by itself can't do it. Technology only works when you combine it with other inputs. Okay, what number was that one here? That was number 3, technology. Our 4th, good, effective institutions. We've discussed institutions for a while in this course. We know that good, effective institutions are the 4th ingredient to economic growth. What is an institution? We've talked about it a lot. Let's formally define it. An institution is a significant practice or custom or relationship or organization in a society. It's a very broad term, okay? And it applies to lots of different things. It could be practices, it could be customs, relationships, organizations in a society, okay? Institutions, sometimes they're official, set by law. Sometimes they're unofficial, set by culture, set by tradition, set by informal arrangement and agreement of the citizens. But at its core, institutions, they shape the environment, and critically, they shape the incentives by which decisions are made, okay? What are some of the institutions that we're talking about? Well, we've mentioned some of them. Private property rights are critical. Political stability, the rule of law, equality under law, the absence of corruption, really big. You know, this is a big part of the reason why, especially in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, growth rates stall. You know, there's just really no political stability and there's a lot of corruption. And if you think about it, if there's corruption, it's very difficult for business owners to decide to invest in that country, because you never know if your investment will provide return. And you never know that if your investment does provide a return and a profit, will you get to keep it, or will it be stolen, absconded with by corrupt government? Will you be forced to pay massive bribes to keep operating? So corruption is a really big deal. Other institutions include open competitive markets, well-functioning tax systems, and going back to our discussion on inflation, stable money, stable monetary policies, and predictable, stable prices, okay? One way, when you take a look at institutions, to sort of broadly categorize them are as inclusive versus extractive. Inclusive institutions, the good ones, they allow all members of society to benefit. On the other hand, what some theorists call extractive, sorry, let's get this cleaner. What some people call extractive institutions, they do not benefit anybody. In the case of extractive institutions, these special rights, these special privileges are only given to insiders, to cronies. And in effect, this allows those insiders to extract wealth from the rest of the general public, okay? And that's not a good thing. And finally, our 5th and final ingredient to economic growth would be natural resources per capita. You recall that the resources included land, labor, capital. Here, we're talking about the land resources. Natural resources per capita, they include physical land, They include the inputs that occur naturally in that land or on it, things like iron ore and timber, and in some places now specific specific minerals and compounds needed for high-tech manufacturing, silica, all these other things that you need to produce capital. Those are land resources. Note that resources can also include like the geography or even the physical location of a country. Note that most countries can't control this. This is what you're stuck with. This is what your country has or doesn't have. But natural resources are important. This is debated though, because even though all economists agree that resources are important, there's a big debate right now in economics as to whether natural resources, specifically excessive natural resources, are a blessing or a curse. We see, for example, that some countries that are, for example, blessed with lots and lots of oil deposits, they grow wealthy. Yet other countries that have equally large oil deposits stay poor. So this is called the resource curse in macro theory. It's a pretty big topic of debate. Are resources a blessing or a curse? Let's summarize it this way. Let's say that natural resources probably do play an important role in productivity, but that their impact on long-term sustainable growth is less clear. The classic example here is the contrast between Liberia and Hong Kong. Liberia, a beautiful country, has loads of natural resources, fertile land, lots of land mass, lots of natural resources. Hong Kong has none for the most part. Yet Liberia has stayed poor for generations, and Hong Kong is an advanced economy. So we'll conclude this by saying that our fifth ingredient, natural resources per capita, it's important, but it's not sufficient to give us long-term sustained growth. There you go, my friends. We learned in our first video what economic growth was, and now after this video, you understand 5 of the key factors, the key ingredients that can lead to economic growth. Your big takeaway, though, should be not just what those 5 are, but the subtleties, that individually, none of them will get the job done, that an economy has to combine them in creative ways underscored by innovation. And critically, that for each of these for each of these factors that we identified, there's going to be some caveats, some exceptions, okay? Economic growth is not a black and white issue. It's very much in debate. There's lots of different theories, but we care about this because we care about people, okay? Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.